Good morning, and welcome to the third day of the winter school at the Arab Center. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Faisal Devji today. Professor Devji provided us with a very short, humble biography, and then I took the liberty of expanding it a little bit so that they get to know you and your work better. Professor Devji is a fellow of Balliol College at the University of Oxford, where he holds since 2025 the Bate Professorship of Global and Imperial History, and it's one of the University of Oxford's most prestigious professorships, established in 1905. He earned his PhD in intellectual history in 1994 from the University of Chicago and was elected as a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows, after which he ran the graduate program at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. Returning to regular academic life in 2003, he taught for 2 years at Yale University and another 4 years at the New School for Social Research in New York, arriving in Oxford as reader in Modern South Asian History in 2009. His academic interests include the intellectual and political thought of modern South Asia, as well as the emergence of Islam as a global category. He has also focused on the cultural and philosophical meanings of violence and the emergence of nonviolence as a political project. He has authored 5 books, and I'll mention 3 of them. The first, The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, published in 2012 by Harvard University Press. It's a major intervention in political thought, reframing Gandhi as a theorist of violence, ethics, and political action, rather than a pure moral icon. The other one, and you're well known for this book in particular, Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, also published by Harvard University Press in 2013. It's an intellectual history of Pakistan as a political and moral idea, situating Muslim nationalism within global debates on sovereignty, minorities, and post-imperial politics, and drawing comparisons with Israel as a Zionist project. And the last project, which is his last publication, Waning Crescent, The Rise and Fall of Global Islam, published by Yale University Press last year, 2025. It has gotten rave reviews already. I've read a couple. It's an intellectual history of Islam as a political and civilizational project that began in the age of European empire and the crisis of Muslim sovereignty, examining the ramifications of such changes for the contemporary Muslim world. It's a pleasure to have you here, Faisal, and we look forward to your talk. You have 45 minutes, and if you want to go for less, that's fine too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal. It really is a pleasure to be here, and especially to be hosted by Amal Ghazal, who is a dear friend of long standing from Vancouver days. It's a pleasure to see you here and to be here. So at the risk of boring you, I will read out my comments. Otherwise, I'll go off-piste and we'll end up 2 hours later with me still going on. So I'm interested in this paper in locating liberalism within a larger set of concerns about politics and history. As a historian, I think that should be my approach. So politics has long been unthinkable without history. All political actors are required to speak historically, invoking the past either as an ideal to be revived or a disaster to be avoided and overcome for a better future. However naive or sophisticated, in other words, the political imagination is resolutely historical in identifying genealogies of the present and precedents for the future. Yet politics has not always or everywhere been imagined in historical terms, and the two were arguably first joined together in Western Europe during the 18th century as a response to the collapse of Christendom's normative order following the Reformation. In his 1959 book, Critique and Crisis, the German historian Reinhard Koselleck claimed that the rupture of religious and political norms represented by the Reformation led initially to the making of a secretive and Machiavellian politics in absolutist monarchies. Divorced from any public norm and drawing upon history discontinuously in the form of exempla, this politics came to be opposed by what was at first an equally esoteric but strongly historical imagination among the new middle classes who eventually overthrew absolutism. It was the latter's victory that made for a new normative order premised upon the idea that people could shape their own futures in and by reference to history. For the absolutists, civil war served as the most serious threat to any polity, one that was internal to and even inherent in them all. This view of civil war as something that had to be forestalled at any cost was replaced by the Enlightenment idea of revolution as a mode of producing the future and even predicting it by reference to what were sometimes called the laws of history, as theorized in their most popular forms by figures like Hegel and Marx. This powerful way of thinking about politics in historical terms, however, could never fully define it. And in some quarters of social life or in other parts of the world, philosophy, epic, and myth still allowed politics to be imagined differently. In colonial societies like India, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, for example, Hindu thinkers deliberately eschewed the historical language in which British imperialism described and justified itself. This was a language of historical progress, in which British rule was seen as preparing Indians for self-government in an undefined future. They turned instead to an ancient philosophical text, the Bhagavad Gita, to imagine Indian politics and the freedom it sought without the necessity of any historical reference. One of these men, Gandhi, even repudiated history itself as a record of violence that he thought was capable only of provoking fear and hatred. Today we seem to be living in the twilight of the revolutionary age inaugurated by the Enlightenment, one that had defined political projects as varied as liberalism, communism, and fascism. The end of the Cold War led not only to the collapse of the laws of history in their Marxist variant, but inevitably and as a consequence in their liberal or Hegelian interpretation as well. We are thus in a situation where conventional historical narratives no longer suffice to account either for our present or our future. Might the repudiation of history in anti-colonial politics allow us not only to see this moment differently, but also to imagine its future? We are subjected in the press and social media to the seemingly endless proliferation of precedents drawn from the past and told that our time resembles a new 1848 or a new 1914 or a new 1939. But the revolutions and wars led by Western Europe cannot define a global arena which has long moved beyond their influence. All these precedents are inevitably Western European and sometimes American. This is why the plague of precedents that rain down upon us from best-selling books and important articles fail to hit their mark and represent the anxiety of an historical imagination which can no longer account for the world. This is a world in which Asian and African politics is not bound to reference European precedents or work towards replicating Western achievements. The rise of China bears little comparison with that of Britain or the United States. But if European and American history no longer defines global politics, no rival or alternative to it exists either, with all other historical narratives naming at most a regional politics. Perhaps a different understanding of familiar historical accounts might help us in this situation. It could be more intellectually productive, for instance, to see not the Second World War, but the process of decolonization that followed it as the most important global event of the 20th century, or at least its latter half. By abandoning the war as surely the most popular cliché defining Euro-American histories of the present, such a shift of perspective may even allow us to recognize the emergence of the European Union as a post-colonial rather than a post-war polity. Not only did European integration become possible only after decolonization, if also in the wake of the Second World War, it was sometimes even led by ex-colonial administrators as well. And the kind of non-sovereign federation the EU constitutes had initially been imagined by these bureaucrats together with some of those they governed as representing the future of any number of colonial territories from South Asia and East Africa to the West Indies. Several experiments in such federalism were conducted in Africa, Asia, and the Americas before it was tried out on a large scale in Europe. where other federal traditions were also represented in socialist countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, which, along with the Soviet Union, did not survive the Cold War. Socialist federations possessed sovereignty as well as ideologies meant to unite the nations comprising them. Neither is true of the European Union, whose post-colonial character is illustrated by the desire of Scottish or Basque nationalists in the continent's west and Georgians or Ukrainians in its east for membership. But they want to join not in the name of supranational ideology, as with socialist experiments in federalism, nor to claim sovereignty from Britain, Spain, or Russia, as in conventional accounts of decolonization. Perhaps it is to escape sovereignty altogether. The kind of civil war these national movements set up as a possibility, therefore, would be against sovereignty on the one side and for it on the other. Yet a change in perspective may not be enough to preserve the link between politics and history. With the recycling of historical precedents, we see today a sign of desperation rather than revival. The supposed return of white or Christian nationalism, fascism, racism, misogyny, and the like in North America and Western Europe betrays a poverty of political imagination more than anything else. For whatever the violence they inspire, these movements cannot do without the very people they would condemn and expel. Women and non-white people are thus central to many apparently far-right movements in the West, whose leaders are often also married to immigrants. However hierarchical the relations between different sexual, racial, and religious groups are meant to be in this political imagination, therefore, its vision of order is honeycombed with categories of people who are not meant to belong there. The attack of a MAGA crowd on the US Capitol at the end of President Trump's first term in office, by way of example, included people waving Indian and Imperial Iranian flags, as well as figures like the Afro-Cuban leader of the Proud Boys. All of them were hospitably accommodated by the so-called white nationalists at the Capitol with their Confederate flags and longing to refight the Civil War to a different conclusion. The whole thing looked like a conservative version of multiculturalism. The far-right movements of our day, in other words, do not have either a singular or even an alternative historical imagination to define politics. And this may be why so many of them refer to civil war as their chief historical precedent. Not the American Revolution, with its founding role in the Enlightenment's logic of history, therefore, but the questioning of such a logic in civil war has emerged as an ideal as much as a threat for MAGA and other movements. Does civil war represent an historical precedent here, or the dissolution of history along with that of the nation, its most important political agent? Either way, it returns us full circle to Koselleck's argument. In his book, Civil War gave way in the 18th century to revolution as a way of imagining the union of history and politics. The return of civil war to the political imagination may thus signal the dissolution of this relationship, even if only and paradoxically in the name of history itself. Yet the move from revolution to civil war is not unusual outside the West. In colonial India, for example, revolution seemed a distant prospect, whether in struggles for national independence or equality between castes and religions, to say nothing of class war. In this context, revolution was often read back to the past as a glorious but defeated event confined to history. It was instead civil war, understood as marking both India's present and future, that often came to be seen in a positive light because it was conceived as a temporary measure leading to a lasting peace. Unlike Europe or America, with their destructive civil wars, India had not experienced such internecine conflict in the past, and so its thinkers entertained a rather different vision of it. In the early 20th century, for example, the Hindu nationalist leader V.D. Savarkar wrote a book about Hindus and Muslims uniting against the British in the Mutiny of 1857, which he saw as a revolutionary war. But when considering the present, he thought Muslims would have to be defeated in a civil war and forced to acknowledge India as a Hindu nation by giving up their own history. Gandhi, for his part, thought a civil war preferable to India's partition along religious lines. He held that a fratricidal conflict based on the intimacy of its contending parties offered the possibility of a non-violent resolution, whereas the war's internationalization through partition would make Hindus and Muslims permanently irreconcilable as foreigners. The civil war that India's partition was meant to prevent cast a violent shadow upon the independence of its divided nations, as well as in the recurring riots against minorities within both countries. But it only broke through the carapace of a historical narrative dominated by decolonization in 1971, when the civil war between Pakistan's two wings prompted India's intervention to help in the creation of Bangladesh. Founded at the tail end of decolonization globally, Bangladesh was not a post-colonial state, but emerged out of its destruction in a civil war. This is why colonialism plays such a minor role in its national imagination. The founding of Bangladesh marked the end of decolonization and the beginning of a new politics in which civil war became the motor producing new states globally. What Indian thinkers foregrounded in their discussion of civil war in colonial times was its character as a fraternal conflict. This is why a text like the Bhagavad Gita, drawn from an epic about a war between two sets of cousins, was so important for them. But this way of thinking does not define contemporary debates about civil war in the West, though the betrayal of brotherhood serves as a major theme in such conflicts. And that is likely because the political imagination there is still fed by historical narratives rather than mythic or philosophical ones, even as this imagination gradually casts off the hold of history as a project of self-making defined in revolutionary terms. Of course, civil wars are not always distinct from revolutions or any other example of people making their history by reading a future from the past, including through peaceable transfers of power, as was the case in India. But it is the category that comes to define these sometimes ambiguous events which ends up giving them historical meaning. A number of self-proclaimed revolutions in the recent past, for instance, have not managed to retain their names and become instead bywords for civil war. These include the color revolutions of Eastern Europe and Central Asia following the Soviet breakup, and those of the so-called Arab Spring during the War on Terror that itself only became possible with the Cold War's end. Both these revolutionary waves, each sweeping through a number of countries, were led by popular movements that had forsaken the traditional structures of revolutionary action, including loyalty to a political party with a strong base of cadres. They also lacked a strongly historical imagination. These revolutions thus illustrated the dissolution not just of a political order, Soviet clientelism in one case and Western clientelism on the other, but also that of an entire historical language and imagination. And in this way, they represented the dissolution of the Cold War international order without being able to put a new one in its place. The collapse of this order is even more evident today with the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. These waves of revolution removed or seriously damaged the remaining Cold War republics of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, especially those that claimed to be ideological states. With the destruction of Iraq, Libya, and Syria, along with the military coup in post-revolutionary Egypt, Iran is today the last of these states, itself undergoing its own process of possible dissolution at the moment. Iran having been founded late in the Cold War and just as late to transition into another kind of polity. It is likely kept in place by the sanctions regime of its Western enemies and one of those ironies in which history abounds. But its Islamic vision of historical progress no longer has many buyers either inside or outside the country. At the same time as Islam is ceasing to play a role in imagining politics, Christianity has returned to it on the European and American right. But apart from examples of Christian persecution and the allegedly millennial battle of Christianity with Islam, there is little historical imagination to be found in such nationalism. If anything, and in a reversal of the colonial relationship between European Christians and Asian or African Muslims, it is the history of Islam that gives meaning to Christianity, understood as an imperiled civilization. And this is yet another way in which we can see not just the European Union, but also the idea of Western civilization that has come to define it in post-colonial terms. Could it be that the Christian nationalists focus on heterosexual and biological gender norms, natalism, and natural law represents the displacement of history by doctrine as in the pre-Reformation past? While neither is sophisticated nor is deliberately anti-historical as the Hindu politics envisioned through the Bhagavad Gita, such a development might indicate the renewed importance of principles and moral ideas rather than history in the making of a new political imagination. but it is one without hegemonic aspirations, defining the particularity of the West in a defensive way against migrants, liberals, and globalists that resembles nothing so much as certain forms of colonial nationalism. So I want to insist here on the fact that the critique of liberalism, what we spoke about yesterday as post-liberalism, doesn't simply return to some kind of ever-continuous Western history. It is mediated by colonial and post-colonial history. And the reference of Christian nationalism is almost explicitly to Islam. These movements are therefore characterized by a disavowed identification with the very minorities, migrants, and ex-colonies they repudiate. And this precisely because the once hegemonic histories of the West, whether capitalist or communist, no longer suffice to explain the world. But the problem is that the Muslims and others with whom right-wing Europeans might negatively identify are themselves defined by equally negative histories in which the West is often the only real subject. Most recently in 21st century forms of militancy like Al-Qaeda. The historical imagination of politics has thus entered into a vicious circle here. For Koselleck, the twinning of politics and history occurred with the rise of a middle class in Western Europe and was therefore linked to the new dominance of capitalism there. Does the dissolution of their relationship today also tell us something about the history of capitalism? The end of the Cold War, which played a crucial role in the dismantling of a revolutionary narrative, also led to economic globalization and the triumph of neoliberalism through the 1990s. And it is in this context that we should place the fragmenting relationship of history and politics. Globalization saw the export of manufacturing to Asia and the financialization of many Western economies, which came to rely upon service and sometimes extractive industries. In this situation, the old industrial working class disintegrated, and without its anchoring, a whole structure of social relations based on class interest also fragmented. Identities came to be delinked from conventional economic interests, with the latter no longer able to represent themselves in political parties as they once had. Instead, they came to be defined as groups exercising consumer choice. This is why the age of globalization and neoliberalism, with its faith in market rationality, was also the age of identity politics on the right as much as the left. No longer anchored to distinct economic and political interests, parties could now appeal to all and sundry, often on the basis of so-called wedge or identity issues that could be worked up into culture wars. But this also meant that their constituencies were no longer stable, and so venerable political parties could fall apart and untested ones attain power, as in Greece, Italy, and France. In many places, old parties were hollowed out and taken over by adventurers like Donald Trump. This is really extraordinary, the way in which political parties in a lot of Western Europe and the Americas have been hollowed out, taken over, or collapsed to be succeeded by parties that didn't even exist a few years before. In these circumstances, the emergence of innumerable histories about different kinds of identity disguised the coming apart of history and politics more generally. Failed military projects like the War on Terror, which sought to entrench a neoliberal vision of order globally and under US supervision, only accelerated the breakdown of older historical narratives without replacing them with any alternatives. This was a period marked by the global popularization of postmodernism as an intellectual trend and its recognition that the age of grand narratives had come to an end. These grand narratives included those of class, sex, nation, and even the self. The shift of manufacturing to Asia, however, did not lead it to some new age of interest politics and grand narratives. Already in colonial times, thinkers like Gandhi had recognized that interests were linked to capitalism because they understood subjects as being defined by property. Individuals not only owned themselves in Lockean terms, but were also meant to recognize their collective identities as possessions so as to own them in a capitalist way. But since property could not define all social relations in a poor country like India, Gandhi thought that interest remained a partial and incomplete category there. It was presumed to exist in law, but did not actually define many of the supposedly irrational practices of Indians. But Gandhi also thought that interest could not fully define any society, since relations between lovers or within families were meant to be disinterested. He saw the sacrificial potential of disinterested action as crucial for the national movement and found philosophical justification for it in the Bhagavad Gita. So rather than interest, if you will, the crucial liberal category, which defines every kind of political action, in places like colonial India, people like Gandhi defined political action through the removal of interest and indeed through the sacrificial action of disinterestedness. Gandhi was not alone in wanting to expand the scope of disinterested action, despite acknowledging that it could sometimes be violent and even terroristic. He surmised that the interest politics of the European bourgeoisie could never be replicated in places like India, where they only serve to exacerbate violence between groups. Gandhi's repudiation of history was premised upon his criticism of interest and the kind of politics it made possible. And while history remains a contentious subject in India despite Gandhi, he was likely correct in seeing both its potential for violence as much as its inability to define all social and political relations. In China, however, communism, with its strongly historical character, remains the defining narrative of politics, though it seems to be increasingly confined to domestic rather than international matters. In the latter, it is a new civilizational language that now takes precedence, bringing China closer to other large countries like Russia, India, and the US of the Trump administration. China's domestication of Marxism betrays the recognition that communism and its historical narrative of class struggle can no longer define politics for the world at large. Yet China's civilizational language also shares the limitations of Euro-American narratives about the West in its non-hegemonic and multipolar implications. There's always more than one civilization. Here too, in other words, history and politics have been de-linked, though for very different reasons than in the West and without its paranoid tendencies associated with visions like that of civilizational decline. For China's decline, like India's, is meant to be seen in the past and is in the process of being overcome. There is no declinism narrative in these places, as far as I can tell, as there is in the West. We have seen how the end of decolonization as an historical process led to the reemergence of civil war as a way of thinking about as well as conducting politics in the 1970s, starting with Bangladesh and Biafra. A similar thing happened at the end of the Cold War, first in socialist and ex-Soviet territories and then in those of Western client states. These civil wars signaled the coming breakdown of the international order itself, whose establishment had been the Cold War's chief achievement and was premised upon a politics defined by the balance of power. Without a bipolar world, such an order has no meaning, and its disintegration is proceeding even more rapidly in our own time. So ironically, the international order, which we tend to call the post-war order and value as such, might only have been made possible in and through the Cold War. This seems to me to be the argument of Sandrine Cott's recent book. Whereas the civil wars that emerged at the end of decolonization and the Cold War interrupted the logic of history here and there, it was the accelerating dissolution of the international order itself, with a turn against globalization, that put the political imagination at risk more generally. We see this with the migration of a civil war imaginary from the peripheries of the old international order to its center. So whereas these older understandings of civil war from the colonial and the post-colonial world and then the post-Soviet world and that of Western client states in places like the Middle East, you now have that imagination returning to the very center of Western Europe and North America. The two most significant political categories to come out of the end of globalization in the new millennium were undoubtedly populism and polarization. And what they put into question was precisely the neoliberal vision of a world governed by market rationality that had defined globalization. Rather than serving to contradict polarization with an appeal to national unity, populism depends upon it by opposing one part of the people to another within the nation. Immigrants are in this view proxies for liberals, the left, globalists, and the like, with their purported remigration not meant to heal the national community so much as ensure the victory of one part of it over another. They are proxies for a war within the nation itself. Polarization and populism work together to create a kind of institutionalized civil war in which public opinion is shattered. This situation is often attributed to social media and its creation of global rather than national publics, themselves fragmented into silos, preventing mutual communication. But this is to ignore structural factors for technological determinism. The destruction of public opinion allows governments to dispense with political norms and even trade one support base for another in a polarized electorate. The way in which the MAGA crowd that supported President Trump can be dispensed with for the neoliberals who supposedly opposed Trump overnight with the attack on Venezuela is a good illustration of this. The fragmentation of constituencies and hollowing out of political parties in the period of globalization have made these shifts commonplace. Yet the liberation of states from an increasingly disjointed public opinion comes at the price of their delegitimization and weakness as democratic polities. The invasion of Iraq during the War on Terror marked perhaps the Anglo-American West's first serious break, both with the international order represented by the UN, as well as with domestic popular support, and has led to the increasing liberation of executive power from legislatures as much as public opinion. In moving beyond the international order and public opinion, Western countries created a tradition that continues with their increasingly unpopular support of war in Gaza and elsewhere in the region. They are quite unlike Russia, China, or India in this sense, all of which still depend on some version of public opinion, however manipulated, and the stability it provides even undemocratic states. It is these non-Western powers which now also strive to preserve the international order put in place during the Cold War, since it is one in which they have long wanted to have more say. And this is even truer of smaller countries which cannot afford to do without shared norms and collective security. It is therefore the West that represents revisionism in international affairs. In these circumstances, the resort to history, whether in reference to human rights or international law more generally, becomes meaningless, with the conspiratorial thinking that characterizes polarized societies searching for politics in the Machiavellian realm of absolutism, arcana imperii. Koselleck had criticized the thinkers of the Enlightenment for disregarding the absolutist state's caution in dealing with the threat of civil war, since they opened the door to what it took to be its new form in revolutionary violence. But the secretive working of contemporary governments does not reprise absolutist politics, signaling instead the loss of a historical narrative to account for the present or imagine and create a future. Let us return to the colonial world for an example of politics without history. Interest, we saw, is the crucial category of modern politics, for it is interests that are meant to be represented in electoral politics, as well as come together in contractual relations to define society. The fragmentation of interests thus weakens both representation and contract. And without them, not only does liberalism cease to be a meaningful concept, but so does communism as its inadvertent product and dialectical successor. The two kinds of historical narrative represented by them were thus put into question in the colonies just as they are with globalization, though they continue to be posed against one another in ghostly battles and as endlessly recycled memes in our own time. So the continuous American invocation on the from the U.S. government of Marxism, cultural Marxism, and communism as a foe to be fought, when we know that there is hardly any Marxism in place with any kind of political integrity in that country. Let us return to the colonial world. In colonial societies where interests were understood as being limited, their political representation and contractual relations were also distrusted as ways of providing opportunities for powerful and populist groups to dominate weaker ones. The parties to Indian politics were seen as being composed not of varying interests, but permanent identities which made democracy impossible as a system in which the majority and minority should occasionally change place. It was this distrust that defined the relations between caste, religious, and linguistic groups in India and led to its partition, seen both as a civil war and the effort to forestall it. Is this the kind of situation Western societies now face, even if it results from a very different history? Some Indian politicians sought to address this situation by trying to produce interests where there didn't seem to exist, and so make possible a polity structured in liberal ways by contract and representation. But others, like Gandhi, tried to supplant, if not replace these categories, with others which belong to a different political imagination. Interest, we saw, he substituted with sacrifice, while contract was replaced by love or friendship, and representation with relations unmediated by collective identities. In doing so, he lifted out the very social relations that were meant to define the inner lives of these opposed identities, as if to show how sacrifice, love, and immediacy could best be manifested between rather than only within them. So the very social relations that are understood as being internal to interest groups or other social and political categories, which these categories cannot do without, even in the, as it were, in the acme of any kind of liberal order, is what Gandhi attended to and suggested that disinterestedness, love, sacrifice, friendship really not only defined more strongly than interest, than self-interest, any particular category of identity or politics, but therefore could also define relations between them. Gandhi's argument was that evil must be undergirded by goodness if it is to achieve any mass following. However villainous a leader, therefore, he had to depend upon the sacrifice, love, and unmediated loyalty of his followers, all of which were indubitably virtues, even if badly used. And Gandhi was interested in how such followers, like the troops of the wicked prince in the Mahabharata, might be detached from evil. The task of the non-violent activist was to discover and rescue this goodness from the grasp of evil by demonstrating its true form in a way that might bring the evildoer to a better understanding of his or her own professed ideal. And what interests me about this argument is not how realistic or unrealistic it is, but rather how unhistorical and indeed undialectical. Apart from his reference to myth rather than history, Gandhi refused to distinguish the virtues of one party from the vices of another. Rather than asking political actors to abandon one historical narrative for another, he wanted them to be true to themselves, or at least to their own ideals, whatever they were. Foregoing a politics that demands the conquest or conversion of an opponent, Gandhi saw nonviolence as an effort in self-discovery. Such a vision preserves political plurality without having anything to do with interests, while at the same time repudiating history as a narrative giving such interests their collective identities. And while Gandhi's political imagination may not be replicable everywhere, it demonstrates the possibility of a politics without history. Yeah, I'm coming to my conclusion. If Koselleck was right about politics and history coming together in the name of revolution during the Enlightenment, then the fading of the revolutionary tradition may signal the coming apart of these categories in our own time. This process appears all the more evident with the return of civil war to the political imagination. And while it may seem that all those exercising such an imagination possess historical accounts of their own, I have tried to show here that these are limited at best. Invoking civil war means acknowledging the incoherence and even extinction of any national community, itself understood as the collective agent of history. Whether another protagonist of this kind can emerge from such a war to inaugurate a new politics remains an open question, but it is unlikely to have recourse to any single history. It is in this context, where historical narratives privileging Western actors and events have lost the power to account for the world, that colonial efforts to do without history become meaningful. Rather than returning to the pre-modern past, they show us the possibility of a new political language emerging against the prose of history. That does not mean the end of historical consciousness, of course, but instead breaking the bond between politics and history. The ostensibly historical narratives of present-day politics are already dissolving, with liberalism following communism into decline and the apparent return of fascist and other far-right visions marking a desperate quest for some historical alternative dredged up from the past, but in fact quite meaningless today. Religion has emerged as one alternative way of thinking about politics globally, though it is still mired in civilizational talk that has itself been dug up from the past. But the civilizational language deployed by the Americans, Russians, Indians, and Chinese is remarkably light on history and resembles more an assemblage of ideas or values. In this sense, it represents the fag end of history's grand narratives. Ethics or philosophy is another and perhaps more viable option, one we already see playing a part in the culture wars of the post-Cold War world, from political correctness to woke on the left and free speech on the right. Again, the historical carapace within which these views are sometimes placed tends to be ephemeral at best. These developments arise from the fact that the old ethics of the international order, from human rights to crimes against humanity, have been abandoned by the most powerful states, and so demonstrate the decline of that order. The new morality to be seen among their citizens and others around the world, therefore, represents the direct descendant of Gandhian nonviolence in form, if not content. It is often anti-statist and deeply individualistic, but without, as yet, much of a collective political form. Manifested in populism as much as polarization, such views may develop into new kinds of political movements in the future, and perhaps history in this future will become a form of knowledge that can analyze politics without constituting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal, and thank you for bringing some insights from previous works into contemporary discussions. We'll take a first round of questions. We'll start with Ismail. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you, Faisal, for this really very rich and stimulating presentation. I have a minor comment. And it seems to me that we need to distinguish between history as a category, in the Hegelian sense, and the actual events and activities of real living individuals. Because it seems to me that there is a conflation, because you are talking about history as a global processes, and you are relying on, in a sense, on Hegel, or Hegel is the condition for us to talk about history, capital H. And then you present histories, small h. And it seems to me that the argument that there is a non-history is a historical argument. So there is a historical formation that we name non-history. And this is exactly the contradictions of the Hegelian argument between the history as, as a global movement and the small histories that you were talking about. So this conflation between history as a category and history as a real living processes need to be flushed more, because your argument that ethics and philosophy are one way out of this entrapment, it seems to me no less problematic as the category of history itself. What do you mean by ethics? There are different strands of ethics or philosophy. So what I want to ask you is if you could elaborate more about your conception of history as a global process, and these small histories, that most of the small histories are not written in the global capital H history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. This was really wonderful and thought-provoking. So I had a question for you about this kind of distinction that you drew in Gandhi's thought between interestedness and disinterestedness, which is presented in your talk as a kind of binary. But I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on that more and kind of dialecticize that. Because when you were talking about, for instance, Gandhi's invocation of love as a kind of alternative, for me, I was thinking about a different word, which is, of course, solidarity, which has a kind of dual nature as both interested and disinterested, insofar as there's a kind of ethic of restraint and sacrifice that's inherent to solidarity, but of course it also has an interestedness insofar as the kind of form that solidarity takes is, of course, also a way of emancipating yourself, even if the kind of day-to-day or the kind of immediate sense is one of disinterestedness. So there's a more complex relationship between these two than it seems to me that you've expounded upon with reference to Gandhi. And you referenced this notion of self-discovery in Gandhi and the kind of individuality of that. But of course, the solidaristic struggle is one of collective emancipation, and it's also a process of self-discovery. But it's one that has a more historical tone, insofar as that collective self-discovery is a historical act. And so I wanted to ask you if you could expound upon that, because I don't think that, for instance, you referenced Marx in the talk, this Marxian axiom of from each according to his ability to each according to his need is an act of sacrifice. It's an act of disinterestedness. It's an act of not taking everything which you are quote unquote entitled to in the kind of liberal worldview. Of course, it's not disinterested insofar as you are also collectively emancipating yourself. So I just wanted to ask you to expound upon that kind of dialectic between interest and disinterest, if you could. Thank you.
Yes, perhaps I can join my voice to the gentleman who spoke first and ask more or less about the same thing, but in a different way. We have somewhat of a conviction in the classic school of realism of international relations, and that implies that there is no need to study history because human behavior that manifests in the behavior of states is more or less stable and it's predictable and repeats itself no matter who's at the helm. And so there is no need to study history whether to predict what's going to happen next or why what's going on today is going on. So I'd like to know your view on that. Thank you so much. So there is no need, we have a saying in Arabic, ليس هدف التاريخ أن يأتيك بالحاضر بل أن يأتيك بالماضي بل أن يفسر ماذا يحصل في الحاضر. The purpose of history is not to tell you about the past, but to explain what's happening in the present. So the classic realist school of IR says that there is no point in studying history because it's not going to help you whether predict what's going to happen next or explain what's going on now.
Well, thank you very much for that, for these questions. On history capital H and history small h, I take your point. And, as you could tell, I was dealing with both these forms of history here. And I put them both together because I think they're actuated by a similar logic insofar as history represents, whether in the big H terms globally or regional histories, ways in which you can think about creating your own future by reference to a past or to understanding your present by reference to a past leading to a future. And that's what I take Koselleck as saying when he links politics to history in the idea of revolution, human beings taking ownership of their future in this way. Now, of course, there are, if you will, non-global histories, and then there are global histories. But in many places, which have not been part of the capital H history, you also have seen the working out of a Hegelian understanding of history. So think about development theory. For a long time, all non-Western states were meant to be proceeding along a certain kind of evolutionary ladder to become liberal democracies or something, or at least workable capitalist societies. And all of this was understood in, if you will, Hegelian terms, though not in the way that Hegel himself might have imagined that happening. So there are ways in which these two things cross each other, the capital H history and the small h history. But again, to repeat, what interests me, or what I take from Koselleck's reading, is this idea that we make our own history and that we learn from it at the same time. On solidarity, I agree with you entirely. I think that, So Gandhi has two. On the one hand, he says that interest is linked to property. Since most people in India have no property, interest cannot define all social relations in India. And in any case, even in the West, interest, self-interest, or even collective forms of interest cannot define all social relations, or that society would cease to exist, or could only be kept in place by force. And so he brings the two together. He's not simply writing about what is possible in India but not possible elsewhere. So in a way, there's a universalism in Gandhi's thought, though not of a Hegelian kind, where he thinks there's a kind of inevitable kind of spreading out of a particular logic. There is no particular logic there. But there are situations which he thinks are universal in different ways. So that's the first thing he says about interest. Secondly, whereas many other Indian nationalists were saying, look, we were colonized because we lost sight of our own interests. We were divided internally, and therefore we need to retrieve our interest or our self-interest nationally. Gandhi said, no, you got it wrong. We were colonized because we were self-interested. We asked the British to come here. We relied upon their goods. We liked the fact that they brought us things. We bought what they brought us. So it was our self-interest that actually ended up in our colonization. And in saying that, he made clear that interest is itself an ambiguous category, depending on how you cut it. Again, like history big H and history small h, interest small I is as capable of acquiescing with your own colonization because you get some stuff out of it, as it is of repudiating colonization. So that's another way in which he thought interest was not a viable category, not just for Indians, but for others. On Marx, I mean, Gandhi doesn't say that much on Marx, but when asked what he thought of Lenin, he says, I would begin where Lenin ends, which is to say the withering away of the state. So it was the anarchist element in, if you will, Marx and certainly in Lenin, that Gandhi really deeply was influenced by. And you can see why, So, the famous saying that you cite is, of course, something that he would have been entirely comfortable with. Now, you could say that what Gandhi defines by love can also be understood as solidarity. He doesn't seem to use that word as much, but I think you can really place love or friendship. He uses friendship a lot. And this is between, say, Hindus and Muslims, or upper caste and lower caste. Right? And so in that sense, I think whether these things can be folded into interest is another question. And since he's so critical of the idea, but then Gandhi's argument is layered, deliberately layered. So he will make an argument that appeals to people who are not wedded to nonviolence, because he knows that most or many people are not. That makes sense to them. But it is an argument that can also appeal to those who do believe, like he does, in nonviolence. So, for instance, during the First World War, he says that he plays a part in recruiting soldiers for the British Indian Army, and people are horrified. How can you do this? Participating in a war and all the rest. And he has one argument for those who are not believers in nonviolence, which is that if we raise these troops, when they come back from the war, they will be answerable to us, Indians. So this is a self-interested argument. If they are raised against our will, against the will of the Indian civilians and nationalists, then when the war ends, we will have returning to us a highly inflated and militarized army which will be used against us by the colonial state. It has been used against the Germans, it will now be used against us. But for the believers in nonviolence, he says, we really need to learn how to sacrifice and to risk our lives. The Western Front and other parts in the Middle East where the Indian troops were sent will be that kind of site. We need to learn how to risk our lives and how to sacrifice for each other. So in a way, his recruitment of troops, you can see this, of course, as his enemies did, as utterly hypocritical, that the recruitment of troops had nothing to do with the logic of war. He's not interested whether the British win or the Germans win, he doesn't care. It has everything to do with making a certain kind of nation possible in India. Right? But there are two parts of the argument, one that is self-interested and the other that is not. So in that way, I suppose you can impute a kind of redefinition of interest to Gandhi. On the question of what is history for, in a way, yeah, I agree with you. So again, returning to Gandhi, he thinks that no one can ever, that learning from history is a fool's errand, that these are always invented. They're kind of rhetorical understandings of the past. And we know that the kinds of histories that inform political action would only be grimaced at by historians because they're crude and historical interpretations change all the time of anything. The Revolution, the Civil War, speaking of America. But the Revolution and Civil War, as they are present in popular debate, have no relationship to academic history. Right? So that on the one hand. So the work history is doing is, it's a work of logic and argumentation, not historical detail, if that goes back to the first question. Right? It's a way of thinking. All those historical details could be replaced by any other historical details. It's not the details that are important. It's the way of thinking about producing a future from a past. And for Gandhi, this too is a fool's errand, because you can never really predict and produce a future. You don't have all the information you need for it. Even if you do, by happenstance, produce such a future, it may be exactly what you don't want in the end. Right? So he's worried by the fact that people are continuously and consistently sacrificing the present for the future. It's the wrong kind of sacrifice in Gandhi's view. So he's the thinker of sacrifice, but he thinks that ethics makes sense only in the present. Obviously, he's interested not in sacrificing means for ends. He thinks ends should be sacrificed for means, if you will. Right? That if you have the right means, the ends will take care of themselves. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about the future and therefore about politics that ethicizes politics in a way. You must think only about the present. If you inhabit the present, you also enjoy the present. You don't sacrifice it for some putative future. And if you deploy nonviolent means in the present, what happens in the future is you create a whole range of different possibilities from which you can then choose. You have a luxury. Whereas if you have a zero-sum understanding of history, you need to produce this or that will happen. It's a purely Manichaean interpretation. Then you might get what you want, which will rebound against you. Or you might get the opposite of what you want, which is equally bad. But you won't get a range of possibilities. Whereas nonviolent means in the present not only allow you to, as it were, inhabit the present, to live in the present, to be in the present, and therefore to be a moral and ethical being, which can only be done in the present, but also to, if you will, inadvertently produce a future that is capable of many more ends are possible in this future. And then you leave the future to the future. So in a way, that is part of his fundamental critique of the historical imagination, which he thinks is all about the wrong kind of sacrifice. you get myths from the past, the wrong kinds of myths from the past, if you will. You sacrifice your present, and what you get in the future is unpredictable in any case.
Well, thank you very much, Faisal, for a very stimulating hermeneutics, the Germans would say, of our world order. I would like to press you about your conjoining of two figures, one of whom might not be so well known, Reinhard Koselleck, whom I met many years ago, and Gandhi. So they are both anti-liberal, to bring us to our theme, for very different reasons. And in the case of Koselleck, known widely as a Schmittian, the preoccupation with order, civil war, revolution is because he's a Hobbesian, to put it very crudely. And he thinks that liberalism was a great contributor to disorder. And he never liked it. He was anti-liberal. We could talk about him at some length. And in his work, there is a sense of tragedy, of what happens when the Christian world disintegrates. I think a not so secret sympathy for Christianity and probably some species of Catholicism and its order was at work in his writings as a great German historian. On the other hand, Gandhi, he doesn't want a Hobbesian state. He is totally opposed to it, as you said, has a certain, in European terms, anarchistic quality. He doesn't like liberal notions of contract. He wants love instead. Liberals, historically, by the way, wrote almost nothing about love, as if love is not part of our being. Replacing interest with sacrifice, a concentration on the present, strong emphasis on disinterested action, anti-modernist, the spinning wheel as a key symbol, not really interested in the Indian constitution, etc., etc. Anti-liberal, to be sure. We are creatures rather like a house with many rooms, and the winds blow through them, and these kinds of metaphors. And I didn't understand, so the question, I didn't understand whether you're a Gandhian criticizing Koselleck, or whether you actually are an anguished liberal, just to add a bit of fun to the discussion. I'm not sure from what I heard. Whether this is this a genealogy you are presenting of the death of liberalism? Or is it a hermeneutics, let's just say, of an anguished liberal who's caught between Gandhi on the one side and Koselleck on the other? I mean, I congratulate you for bringing these two figures together. I never saw it done before.
Thank you. My name is Elias Khalil. I teach economics here at the Doha Institute. I enjoyed your talk about history, imagination, and action which we take for forward-looking future. Let me just start with the Latin phrase, nomen est numen, and that is really to have categories that are able to accommodate thought. What I think is missing is the word happiness. Someone called it love, but I think the broader word happiness, that you are trying to link to interest. That's fine. But before we link it, we have to disentangle the word interest in light of a great thinker, I think, Albert Hirschman, talking about the passions and the interest and the whole Scottish Enlightenment in contributing to the evolution of the term interest. As we know from the schoolmen, interest is about passion, about giving in, succumbing to temptation, while interest is very much a virtue, which Adam Smith celebrated in The Wealth of Nations, as something which is regulative of borrowing from the Stoics is that it is what nature has endowed us with self-interested motives that really are virtuous. So that the concept of interest has been transformed during the 18th century. So I think there are three categories that have to be linked very carefully, and that is passion, which is succumbing to temptations, which occupied the thinkers of the 18th century. Interest as being a new virtue, as celebrated by the Scots, Scottish Enlightenment, and happiness. Happiness is very precarious category that has to be carefully thought out, and there is a lot of work by psychologists and economists about about happiness that is really it probes. I mean, I come to think about the Eastern paradox and what is the link between wealth and happiness. It is not it's not a monotonic, a clear connection. So I think the question that you talk about, we have to immerse in the present, like in Gandhian term, and the present. We are talking about happiness. That should be set aside. Let's just focus on interest and passion. And that is really to enter into solidarity movement is really looking about long-term interest. We install commitment and values. We are taking care of the interest of our great-great-grandchildren. Will we care about the planet? Will we care about our nation? So there is really a very careful distinction between passion and interest. So when we talk about interest, I like to reserve it in the Scottish sense about and Albert Hirschman's sense about really a virtuous pursuit. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for this very enlightening talk. I'd like to return to a particular point that you spoke about, which is civil war. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit upon that. Because, you know, the notion of civil war is seen by a lot of right-wing movements all around the world, particularly the United States, in a kind of nostalgic sense. They do romanticize this as this epic moment wherein they fought liberal ideals but were dealt a crushing blow. And not only that, but they also see it as necessary and possibly even inevitable to move the nation towards a post-liberal order. And so this puts forward the question in my mind, are we living through the inevitable manifestation of stories of defeat, which, as we know, can be much more powerful than stories of victory? If we think about the crucifixion of Christ or the fall of Imam Hussein during the Battle of Karbala, could the stories of defeat be the way in which we understand what is happening today as a continuity of history rather than a disruption of it? And I say this because I think of many nations that arose through primarily, but not solely, the stories of defeat, such as the Islamic Republic of Iran through the Battle of Karbala, or even the fall of the Hindu nation in the Hindu nationalist imaginary. It seems today that many right-wing movements are pushing towards a post-liberal or majoritarian order in order to finally achieve the victory that they perceivably were deprived or robbed of in the past. So, in a nutshell, my question is, could you speak a little bit more about this concept of civil war in the imaginary of right-wing movements, and does it represent a continuity or disruption of history? Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Yes, I mean, I think Koselleck was even a student of Schmitt's, so the connection is very direct. And, you know, the book, Critique and Crisis, is a very interesting book, but it is, shall we say, reactionary in its implications, if not argument, because at the end of it, he seems to plump for absolutism as the ideal or the virtuous form of politics, insofar as, but even then, it's second best, because as you say, if only we had a world in which Christian norms, pre-Reformation Christian norms, were public and defined our politics. But since we can't have that, after the Reformation, what we do have is absolutism. And absolutism's singular virtue is to push aside, almost in a catatonic way, the inevitability of civil war. So I refer to him not because I approve of his politics, but only because he seems to very nicely bring together the link between history and politics through the idea of revolution and the placement of civil war as a disruptive. This goes back to the final question as well, as a form in which, as a form that disrupts that link altogether. So yeah, politically, I have no sympathy at all for him, but he allows me to frame a kind of argument in which I put Gandhi, though Gandhi has nothing to do with Koselleck in any of his concerns. And I put them together in the same way as I would like to put together a kind of standard issue, I don't know, North American or Western European line of argument on liberalism as a historical enterprise, that is, as an enterprise in which people are meant to make their history, and that itself comes out of a history. Putting that alongside with, in this case, colonial or perhaps anti-colonial critiques of liberalism, which are also critiques of history. So if you will, Koselleck represents one side of it, and Gandhi represents another, but I'm not twinning them in any more fundamental way. I mean, you mentioned Schmidt yesterday on that wonderful final panel, and I agree with that Schmidt is, and here Koselleck is Schmidt by default, is very interesting to think about the critique of liberalism in an earlier period. But at the same time, as Schmidt is writing, so is Gandhi, with another kind of critique of liberalism. So, if you will, I'm trying to place those together without unifying them. On Hirschman, I agree, that book is a wonderful book, The Passions and the Interests. And for someone like Gandhi, of course, he realizes that focusing, that doing without interests runs the risk of bringing the passions back in. And he doesn't like that possibility. And he's constantly being faced with it. So his critics always say, you can't control the movement that you have brought into being or that you represent. And that often leads to violence. And so he's constantly having to refute that kind of argument. But he always does so by acknowledging the relationship. That when you dispense with self-interest has its own violence, it's no less violent than the passions in Gandhi's view, right? But when you try to do without it, you are back in the world of the passions, or you could be back in the world of the passions. So you need to guard against that. But he always acknowledges the kinship of the passions and, if you will, disinterested action. Now, you might argue that Gandhi's view of disinterested action is more stoic, so it should be removed. It should be divested of passions altogether. But for instance, in his first great manifesto, Hind Swaraj, Indian Home Rule, he faces the possibility that his vision of nonviolence actually bears a remarkable similarity with acts of terrorism. So I think it's Madan Lal Dhingra who assassinates Sir Curzon Wiley, shoots him in London, and then allows himself to be captured and hung. Right? Is that not a self-sacrificing act? Is that not a disinterested act? It's done in the cause of India's freedom. And Gandhi says, yes, it is both those things. But Dhingra, he says, gave his life in the wrong way. Disinterestedness cannot go alongside violence. And what violence does is it illegitimately brings together, its force depends upon nonviolence. That is to say, its force depends upon sacrifice and disinterestedness. But by twinning that with violence, it destroys that, it makes use of the force while destroying it at the same time. So if you will, this is Gandhi's way of thinking about how to deal with the problem of passion that for Hirschman is what characterizes the world before the early modern entry of interest into political thought. Of course, in that world before early modern interest, you have the regulation of passions. So it's not like you just have passions. And Gandhi also wants to regulate them, but of course he's not using the same language as this Western European one. Happiness and futurity. Yeah, that is really, so, Gandhi himself is, if you will, he destroys the future chances of his own family. He refuses to put them in the way of gainful employment or, as a result, unlike almost any other place you can think of, Gandhi, who is the founding father of the country, his family is nowhere, right? And has never been. He makes sure that that happens. He's against, as it were, making sure, ensuring the influence, power, or indeed, in that sense, happiness of his own descendants. And it's in keeping with his focus on the present. So his idea of happiness is not necessarily linked to futurity, though of course he understands that no government can do without it. So it's interesting to see when, on the verge of India's independence, he more or less anoints Nehru as the new prime minister. But of course, the prime minister and his government has to work like a regular government. They have to plan for the future. Gandhi understands that. But he also wants to make sure that social relations are not themselves entirely defined by this principle of futurity, as he thinks they cannot ever be. And so he wants to limit the reach, the ontological, if you will, reach of, if you will, the principle of futurity and future happiness that characterizes the state. It must be limited and kept in abeyance by a set of social relations that are founded in and depend upon the present. So in the end, going back to Aaron's question, there is, if you will, something of a dialectical relationship created between the two. Though he might like Lenin's withering away of the state, he knows we are not there yet. So but what he's very interested in is social self-governance. And that, he thinks, cannot be defined entirely by the management of the future in the way that states manage the future, collectively speaking. On civil war, yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the way in which civil war returns to the political imagination on occasions. And I think that the end of decolonization is one moment where that happens globally in certain parts of the world. And for me, Bangladesh is a very important, the creation of Bangladesh is a very important event because it literally puts an end to the logic of decolonization. Bangladesh is not a post-colonial state. It is a state founded out of a civil war. It destroys the post-colonial state. And it opens up a new kind of political logic, which you then see in different parts of the world, where it's the post-colonial state itself that comes apart here and there. So it's interesting. You can say post-colonialism began in South Asia and ends in South Asia in some ways. It begins in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan, and it comes to something of a conclusion in 1971. The civil war that was prefigured with partition finally manifests itself in 1971. But the end of the Cold War is another such moment with the emergence of civil war. Now, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm not going to, define what is and what is not a civil war. This is an exercise in ambiguity anyway. But I'm interested in how people think of these events, how they are labeled in the end, and how they are imagined. And so the end of the Cold War is also a moment for the return of civil war to the political imagination in different parts of the world, in bits of Europe, Yugoslavia, etc., in bits of Central Asia. And then you have the coming apart of the last of the Cold War's ideological states in the Middle East and in some other parts of the world, whether they are Ba'athist states or or other kinds of really Cold War creations. As I said, Iran is the last one in the region as far as I can tell. But what is now really interesting, as I suggested, is how civil war has come to occupy the political center in places like the United States and Western Europe, in the as a fear on the side of liberals on the left, but as a desire in the far right, and that is extraordinary. I haven't really seen that at all, ever. As a fear, yes, that goes back to Koselleck, but as a desire, and you know the move from the Tea Party, for which the revolution, the idea of the Tea Party itself, was crucial to MAGA and Civil War and the Confederate flag, which is a sign of the Civil War, is a really rapid transition. But also in England, you have the invocation of civil war. Again, not the old civil war, obviously, of the English Civil War, but a new civil war with migrants or liberals, etc., on the side that needs to be defeated by the far right. And I think this, comes, so, it is almost as if the end of the post-colonial world and the end of the Cold War world, those imaginations or visions of civil war have finally come to inhabit if you will, the center of sort of Euro-American center of the political imagination. And for me, it's another way of thinking about the way in which the non-West mediates politics in the West, and not only through migration or worries about Muslim Islam and all the rest. So we often tend to think about these worries as simply being xenophobic or all about trying to reconstruct a putatively authentic and pure community. But in fact, I think they also signal the failure of a purely Euro-American history in imagining Euro-America itself, that these supposedly foreign bodies that have become so important in the political imagination signal something more than themselves. They really indicate the failure of that particular kind of historical language and the importance of these peoples and places from elsewhere, that it is no longer possible to really separate them out. And as I suggested, even at the heart of the right-wing enterprise, you have women, minorities, and all of these figures. I mean, we are in a situation where the British Conservative Party, which is the most extreme it's ever been in its history, is led by a Nigerian, an immigrant from Nigeria, a woman. She's saying exactly what a white man conservative might have said, but she herself happens to be a Nigerian immigrant. You see similar things in America. The head of the FBI is a Ugandan Asian, like Zohran Mamdani, who is a Ugandan Asian. J.D. Vance is married to an Indian immigrant. You just cannot, even at the heart, if you will, of whiteness, you cannot separate out. And I think that is really, something very interesting. And it should force us to rethink some of the language, the vocabulary, and the rhetoric of the right. They may want expulsion, they may want hierarchy, they may want all those things, but they also can't do without these people and these places.
Thank you, Faisal, for a very rich, insightful session. We need to end the session now. We actually went beyond what the time authorized for us. We still have more questions. We can take them. So thank you again. If you can join me in thanking Professor Devji, please.